Welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is Marie Latulippe and I'm the Director of Science Programs at the Institute for the Advancement of Food and Nutrition Sciences, or IFANS. And we're really excited today to bring you some interesting work conducted through IFANS on nutrition and cognition. And as we start, just a bit on IFANS, who is bringing you this webinar today. We are a nonprofit organization that is focused on advancing food and nutrition science for public benefit. And the way we do that is we bring together scientists from different sectors, government, industry, and academia, and then together they identify research questions that are of common interest. And they develop projects and programs around those interests. And as an organization, what we do is we fund research and we convene experts to deliver workshops, dialogues, and related peer-reviewed publications, just as some examples. And IFANS operates largely through its tripartite committees, and you can see those on the slide here. These committees cover a range of nutrition and food safety topics, as well as scientific integrity. And each of these groups includes representatives from government, industry, and academia. A quick note on logistics for today's webinar. You should have something that looks like this on your desktop, and we welcome you to add questions throughout the program to the Q&A box. Those questions are only going to be visible on the IFANS side, not to everyone, and we will take questions at the end of the webinar after our two presenters. Just to note, also, hopefully you saw during registration that IFANS is an approved provider of CEUs by the Commission on Dietetic Registration, and this webinar is approved for one CEU. We'll provide access to the certificate after the webinar. So to let you know what the learning outcomes are for this webinar, you can see them on the slide here, but briefly, one is to articulate the cognitive domains that may be affected by nutrition and how these can translate into day-to-day effects experienced by individuals. The second is to recognize terms that individuals or consumers commonly use when describing cognitive benefits they're looking for from nutrition. And then third is to convey the complexities of nutrition and cognition research, as well as the strengths and limitations for supporting dietary guidance. And with that, I'm excited to introduce our moderator to you today, Dr. Linda Snetzelaar. And Dr. Snetzelaar is a professor and chair of preventative nutrition education, and she's the director of the Nutrition Center at the University of Iowa. Dr. Snetzelaar also advises the IFANS Cognitive Health Committee to ensure our program drives towards the committee's goals. So Dr. Snetzelaar, if you'd like to join us on webcam, I will turn this over to you to tell us a little bit more about the committee and the subject of today's webinar.
Thank you so much, Marie. Today, we're describing some work that was inspired by increased interest in diets, food, and nutrients for cognitive health and cognitive performance. This interest extends all the way from consumers to researchers to the food industry, and then eventually to policymakers, as we're seeing the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee investigating the impact of dietary patterns on various neurocognitive outcomes. Given this, IFANS was interested in understanding whether the research tools that are available to us today actually align with individuals and what they are seeking in this area. You can see the objective of the project that we'll be discussing today on the slide here. Our goal is to document the links and disconnects between cognitive performance, research terminology, and tools and terms and outcomes understandable to consumers. And really, this work aims to support the scientific substantiation of the cognitive benefits of foods and supplements to advance, eventually, public health. Today, we're going to be hearing directly from some of the research team involved in this work and hear about some of the key findings that inform how we much better approach research on this particular topic. And to begin, I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker, Alicia Ghirardelli, who is a principal research scientist at the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago. Alicia will tell us about the qualitative research that was undertaken relative to the objective. Alicia.
Hi, thank you so much, Linda. Can everyone see me okay? Hear me? Awesome, great.
Yep.
Thank you so much for having me to this webinar today. I'm very excited to share our research and this what we brought to this important work. So our portion of this was to capture the perceptions of the cognitive benefits from food and nutrition supplements. So NORC at the University of Chicago is an independent research organization. We're 80 years old and we started out as University of Chicago's survey research unit and have expanded and have national projects all across the country to deliver important insights and analysis for decision making. So in this project, our role was to explore those consumer perceptions of the cognitive benefits and also to really understand that terminology that consumers use so that we could have that work actually reviewed and interpreted more by the cognitive psychologists so that they could look at the tools and see if there's mapping to be able to test the kinds of things that consumers are looking for and what they're experiencing. So we probed through some qualitative research to understand what consumers are experiencing, what they think about brain health, and also to probe a little bit also the foods and the components and the supplements that they might be using for those benefits. So a little bit about our methodology. We recruited after our IRB approval using sort of a market research approach. And we conducted some advertising through social media. We did this in a way where we actually kind of targeted certain kinds of people that are out in social media using it's called Oracle. It's a database where we are able to look at buyer profiles, look at people that are actually going to supplement retailers, and also kind of have a healthy lifestyle attitude. So we brought people in through those, you can see the two ads that we posted there. And we had a really robust response of over 1,100 people that wanted to be part of these focus groups. We did screen people that came in through the social media platforms. And we wanted to include folks that were over 18, but that fit into certain age groups, and I'll talk about that in a minute. We also screened people in for use of either brain health supplements and food consumption for brain health. We balanced people specifically on using their geographic attributes, so where they lived across the country, as well as some of their demographics, race, ethnicity in particular, and their education levels. We also screened people out if they were registered dietitians or if they were working in the food industry. And then we conducted tech checks, we call them, so that we made sure that individuals were legitimate as well as could be part of these virtual focus groups, and that their screens would work and would their internet connection was solid. So what you can see here is we used actually the dietary guidelines so that we could use those age groups that are included there, 19 to 30, and with the stages that they have included in the dietary guidelines, as well as 31 through 59. We hosted these 90-minute virtual focus groups on a Zoom platform back in 2022. And we had 2 groups each for those age groups. And then I moderated the 4 groups that we had. You can see here our geographic distribution and the number that were recruited and then actually ended up participating, which was almost 40 people. We balanced, as I mentioned, their education, race, ethnicity, and some of their other demographic factors. So diving into the findings, how I'm going to share this with you today is we devised a way to use heat maps so that we could see kind of what stands out in the number of mentions that folks had in our discussion sessions. And the warm colors that you see in the heat maps indicate a higher number of mentions. So people were talking about these kinds of things, these themes that we analyzed and that emerged from that consumer conversation, so that we could see kind of where more of the conversation led to than the cooler or the blue or dark blue colors that you can see, where there's fewer mentions of those themes that we identified in the qualitative data. So getting into what we learned. We first asked people sort of their top of mind of what they think about brain health, how they define it, what it means to them, and how they think about it, and the words that they use to describe it. So the top themes that came out were a little bit different for the 2 age groups. You can see that the older age group there, 31 to 59, they were very interested. They were thinking about brain health as kind of focus and paying attention and concentrating and being on task, sort of one thing at a time, and also managing distractions. They also thought more about it in the way of improving memory, memory functions, retaining information, as well as maybe just even remembering where your keys are. The other thing that stood out for the older age group was reducing anxiety. They thought about brain health in a way of controlling their emotions, being calm and present, and feeling also positive and at ease, and not feeling overwhelmed. We heard these things as well with the younger age group, but it was definitely more of the conversation that emerged as with the older age group in those focus groups. But we did have some themes that overlapped. You can see prevention and aging, maintaining brain fitness, as well as sort of protecting what you have, maintaining that memory and those cognitive functions, but also avoiding dementia and even stroke risk. But you can see here, and also sort of cognitive processing and performance, brain power, brain activity, brain flow, thinking and decision making. Those themes were across the 2 groups in terms of what they're thinking top of mind as what brain health is and how they define it. But the younger age group, we heard a little bit more about sharpness, mental awareness, and some of the things that are sort of daily living. Sleep came into their conversations, as well as using their brain and connections to eating well and being physically active. Other things that came up in those conversations were fighting brain fog and the barriers that they have to actually having effective cognitive performance. And mental health came into those conversations as well, including managing mental disorders like ADHD and sort of attention and depression and those kinds of experiences. So some of our less prominent themes, but still there, we heard about clarity. We heard about thinking clearly and having a clear mind, and also that mind-body connection, feeling the body from the inside out, also sensory experiences and being present in the moment and what you're feeling. And then we heard a little bit about mindfulness and releasing negative thoughts and being at peace. And then also mental stamina, a little bit about energy and maintaining energy levels and the fatigue and having that connected to their brain. And we did hear about stress, but not quite as much as we anticipated. So here's a couple of quotes from our groups. When we asked them about this sort of idea of brain health and what they think about it, one person said, I think it's all just kind of comes down to focus. And that's one of my main priorities with brain health, definitely. We're on social media all day, and it's literally training our brains to have no attention span, of shortening our attention spans. And that's something I feel like we need to actively combat. Another person said, for me, focusing is like focusing on one task at a time, completing it, and then moving on to the next thing. I'm being completely immersed in what I'm doing at the moment and staying on task. A couple of other quotes. I'm always and forever looking for my keys before we go somewhere. It's like my brain health. I can't even remember where my keys are. Another person said, memory is just remembering all the things I have to do in a day, not missing doctor's appointments, not missing my work Zoom calls, not missing and making sure where I'm supposed to be and remembering names and remembering phone numbers. So to summarize, we heard mostly in the older age group for this kind of top of mind what brain health meant to them, focus, memory, and reducing anxiety. Whereas younger adults, when they thought about brain health and what it is, went to sharpness, connections with daily living tasks, processing speed, reducing barriers like brain fog, and mental health. But across the groups, we heard themes of prevention and aging, maintaining function, clarity, and those mind-body connections. So then we went into, well, what are you trying to do? What are the things you're trying to improve? What do you want to improve in your brain functioning? So we probed a little bit more into this area. And I will say that sometimes the groups wanted to venture into, well, here's what I'm doing to improve my brain function. So we had to kind of bring them back to, we're not talking about what you're trying to do, but what are the brain functions that you want to improve? So it was really important for us to kind of stay on track there. And our top themes that we heard when we asked them about what they were trying to improve were focus and concentration. And these were big themes for the younger age group. And then that memory, idea of memory and retaining information and remembering things like phone numbers and people's names, as well as anxiety came up again. And that trying to deal with anxiety in emotional situations, as well as just generally trying to improve my cognitive performance. So a couple more quotes here. I'm finding that since my teen years, my memory is not exactly what it used to be. I tend to be at loss for words and try to remember people's names when I never had that issue before. So I'm always looking for something to improve my physical brain health. I don't know if there's anything that works necessarily. Sometimes I think it's hope in a bottle. My brain is in constant chaos, so any kind of improvement is an improvement. And I'm always trying to find new ways because my neurotransmitters, they've got a lot of stuff going on and I'm trying to coordinate some of it. So our key takeaways from what folks are trying to improve were focus and concentration, remembering things in the short term and as well in the long term, and that information retention. And more so than older participants, the younger ages were thinking about trying to improve their mood or other conditions such as anxiety or depression or ADHD. So then we wanted to ask them, well, what are your perceived benefits from the foods and the supplements that you might be taking? And what do you want those supplements to do? So we heard a lot of different things in this area. And some of those sort of day-to-day activities and effects were important to us. So we were really like when people would say, well, I want to improve my brain function. Well, what does that mean for you in your day-to-day life? Were some of the probes that we used. And we did hear, again, memory and recall, words, names, tasks, even podcasts and remembering what they heard on a podcast, or maybe even information about a TV episode that they had watched the day before. The other one was resisting distractions. We heard about that again from social media and phone and trying to stay on one task at a time. We started to hear a little bit more about sort of things that were happening for folks in an academic environment as well as in work-related environments. So they really took it to these places and environments where they were experiencing things and how they wanted to change those and what they were taking to what was important to them to be able to try to affect and what they were experiencing. And so the academic side, it was trying not to redo something or trying to do something faster or making sure that they were comprehending what they were reading. Multitasking started to come into conversation, trying to do more than one thing at a time, doing things, mixing schoolwork with chores, trying to do something while they were folding the laundry, and then also sort of with the work-related ideas, reducing that afternoon brain fog and being able to continue to stay focused, as well as decision-making and processing and work-related sort of comprehension. Some lesser themes that we heard, but that were still there, was the sort of continuity and being able to continue to master tasks that they had done previously and had done well in school. We also heard a little bit about rest and sleep and processing what people are saying when you're hearing them talk, as well as that sort of some of those work-related things, clarity, focus, attention, and even managing emotional situations at work. So a couple more quotes. Here's one. I almost feel like there's a clipboard on a computer. When you clip something, it's like my brain to be able to hold 1,000 clips because I'm having to prioritize and deprioritize different chunks of information all day long, compare and contrast, and remember all of this fluctuating stuff. So anything I could do to make that a little easier or to seem more successful at that, I'm all for it. Another person said, I work from home. So for me to be able to think and do my job, I used a lot of numbers and spreadsheets. So a lot of times I feel like I could get confused or feel a little bit slower throughout the day if I don't take the supplements I take. So to summarize this section, we heard that in both age groups, the most highly reported function that individuals want to improve by taking brain health supplements or eating foods were memory and recall functions, things that they can do to remember details, but also content that they might have processed and that they want to retain. The other thing was reduction in distractions. That sort of, here we are in this very busy world. How do we resist the distractions from our phones and from social media? As well as younger age groups wanted to speed up their processing and to be able to multitask and to resist brain fog. The other thing that we heard during this sort of probing section was we talked a little bit about their expectations on how long it would take something to affect their brain. And we heard a little bit of both. We heard that they want sort of quick and immediate effects, things that might take, you take something and you get it in 20 to 30 minutes, or things that with like anxiety or staying sort of relaxed was maybe you might have to continue taking something for several weeks or a month to get the effect. So one of our respondents said, I'm always looking for something that's going to work fast. It's like that unicorn out there. You want to take a supplement and feel calm and nirvana in a half an hour. I found that there are some that will work like that, but their effects in my experience tend to be a little more understated than the ones, well, if you have a supplement I take every day and I don't notice anything for at least a week. So a little bit about the foods and supplements that we heard about that folks were taking to affect their brain functions. And we didn't have as much time on this as we did with some of the other themes that we were working through, but we were able to capture a little bit of sort of their top of mind of what they were using in terms of wanting to improve their brain health. So for foods, fruits and vegetables were at the top, especially with the older age groups, thinking about greens and things that were important to eating the rainbow even. Also, nuts and seeds were a huge theme for older adults. Fish oils, as you can imagine, and eating fish. And both groups talked about using caffeine, coffee, or tea. Mushrooms became a part of the conversation, a pretty predominant, different kinds of mushrooms that people are eating, as well as some other things like protein powders and kombucha and other kinds of things that people were using to affect their brain health. We did hear a little bit about chocolate and eggs as well. So the vitamins, that we saw that a lot of people are taking vitamins, and the ones that are underneath here are specifics. They're not included in the ones that are at the top. So we heard just generally, I'm taking vitamins. And then we did actually probe, and some people would say, well, I'm taking them for anxiety and stress. And another person might say, I take them to help with my memory. We did hear about minerals as well, and then some branded supplements that folks were taking that were specific to, this is designed for brain health specifically. We did hear about those kinds of branded supplements that were designed for sleeping, relaxing, also communication, social skills, and focus and concentration. We also heard from the older age group, they're taking amino acids to help with focus, as well as those essential fatty acids. We did hear about herbal supplements as well. The older age groups were tended to be talking about more the herbal supplements. We did hear about nootropics, which are sort of more of a packaged kind of a brain health approach. And then also we heard a little bit about probiotics and some other supplements that people are taking, Racetams, coenzyme Q10, and then also the CBD even. So that's it for me. I'm actually going to turn it over to Haley now. And Haley actually took all of our research and then interpreted it from that sort of cognitive lens and thinking about it from, well, what does this mean for cognitive psychology? So Linda, did you want to introduce Haley for us?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Alicia. I now want to turn things over to Dr. Haley Young. Dr. Young is a lecturer and an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at Swansea University in England. And she'll be talking about work to link these consumer articulated benefits to validated research tools. So, Dr. Young, I will turn things over to you.
Okay, great, thank you very much. Okay, so hopefully you can see my slides. So my role in this project was really to provide an academic perspective and to try and understand whether or not, when it comes to studying the effects of diet, supplements on cognitive health, whether or not there is any kind of alignment between what we actually do in the laboratory and what the consumers think they're getting when they engage with changing their diet or taking a supplement. So very briefly, these are my disclosures. I have been funded by various members of the food industry, major charities, and UKRI. I'm scientific advisor to the Cognitive Health Committee at IFANS. And employed by Swansea University. So there's a little bit that I want to add to the background here, which I'll go over first. Then we'll look at the current misalignment, I would say, between what we're currently doing in the lab and what consumers desire when it comes to taking supplemental change in their diet, before detailing some future directions where I think that research could be quite profitable in this area. So when I think about developing some kind of functional food or a supplement that's going to benefit cognitive health, there are three main groups of people, I would say, that really need to come together in this space in order to make this happen. So in the first instance, you've got the scientists. So these might be university scientists, industry scientists who are primarily interested in discovering new things, right? Then you've got the regulatory bodies. So this is the likes of EFSA, the European Food Standards Association, or the FTC in the US, that are interested in determining whether or not there is actually enough of a scientific basis to be able to make certain claims on certain products. And then, of course, you've got our consumer-facing colleagues. So these might be sort of practitioners who communicate with the public on a day-to-day basis, those that make public health recommendations, marketing team in industry, etc. And I would say that the needs of these three groups can vary somewhat, and it is quite challenging to be able to find the tests and the tools that are required to fit the needs of all three groups. And I would say that historically this has been a bit of a problem for us. So the way I kind of see it is that on one hand, you've got the regulators. And the regulators like EFSA, like the FTC, will use very precise scientific terminology, very precise concepts, and there are clear sort of conceptual boundaries between the things that they talk about. On the other hand, consumers obviously lack that scientific knowledge to some degree, and their concepts tend to be a little bit more vague. There's lots of overlap between the concepts that they talk about. Often consumers will mean more than one thing when they use a particular term. And historically, scientists have, for obvious reasons, tended to align a little bit more to the regulators when it comes to picking their validated tests, which is completely, is necessary. But what this means is that there has been this void almost when it comes to trying to communicate our scientific findings to the public. And this actually is relevant to being able to substantiate some of the claims that we want to make on functional foods or on supplements. So these are a couple of quotes that you can find in the regulation. So the first is from EFSA, and basically consumer understanding is a major part of being able to make a particular claim on a product. Okay, and although the FTC is slightly less explicit about it, they do state that claims need to not be misleading, which implies some element of the consumer needs to be able to understand these and make accurate inferences about it. Unfortunately, when it comes to cognitive health, there has been very, very little consumer research in this space at all. And obviously this does lead to problems when it comes to trying to put claims and things on particular products. And for me, this is where I really see the role of this consumer research coming in. So, by including consumers from the start in the research that we do and using that information to inform the choices that we make, then hopefully we can begin to close this gap a little bit. And this will help us leverage like a major consumer motivation, because it does seem like the consumers are motivated to improve their cognitive health and their mood and such like. But so being able to close this gap, I think, does have potential to benefit public health as well. Okay, so when I started this research, the first step was really to, as Lisa has talked about, as to really try and understand what it was that the consumer wanted. Now, I want to be quite transparent in the approach that we needed to take here. So we utilised something called reflective thematic analysis, which is really quite a flexible approach to qualitative analysis, but it's often quite misunderstood. So from this perspective, there's basically an understanding that the way in which you code a qualitative transcript is very dependent on the filter through which you do that. Okay, so the major distinction here, I think, that is useful to be aware of is that this can be done in a very inductive way, which is purely driven by data, so a bottom-up approach. So you basically go with what the consumers have said. Or it can be quite deductive. So what this essentially means is that you use existing theory and existing knowledge in order to infer exactly what the consumers meant. And as we've seen already, the consumers were quite proficient at explaining what they were looking for in everyday terms. So given those examples, like losing your keys and needing to remember appointments, and having all these clips in the brain and needing to focus on one by one. So as a psychologist, I had to first interpret what they meant when they were describing what they were hoping to achieve, because of course they didn't have that scientific language at their disposal to be able to use it in a clear way like scientists do. So in that respect, the approach that we took was deductive. Latent factors were identified from these examples that the consumers were giving, and it's also a constructionist approach, i.e. using existing theory to understand what was there. And doing that, we first developed a consumer taxonomy of cognitive and affective health in nutrition research. So this is what you can see here. Basically, this diagram illustrates the way the consumers would talk about different terms interchangeably. And having identified the domains that the consumers were actually talking about, whether or not they were actually using things like episodic memory. They didn't necessarily use that term, but they quite clearly described that on some occasions. We were able to develop this diagram, which could then be used to map to potential tests, or at least determine the alignment between what the consumers are looking for and the validated tests that we use. So this was the first stage. And I'm not going to go into each of these because Alyssa has already talked about many of them. Just to say that we essentially use this to understand the alignment with cognitive tests. The next stage was to develop an expert panel from experts who use cognitive tests to understand the effect of diet in their research on a day-to-day basis. And so you can see my colleagues here, who I'd like to thank for taking part in this research with us. Okay, so what you can see in this diagram, so I've highlighted the areas where there is quite good alignment between what the consumers were looking for, the benefits that they were hoping to achieve, and where there are potential cognitive tests that are available to understand the effects of nutrition on those. So, for example, we often measure episodic memory, for instance, using word recall, story recall, etc., etc. Processing speeds, you pick up in reaction times in certain tests. I'm not going to go into all of these because there are obviously many more considerations when it comes to selecting a test. So I'm not here to recommend particular tests today necessarily. I'm happy to take questions on that afterwards if anybody does have any particular questions. But the expert group agreed that in general, we can in some way understand these particular desires that the consumer has and validate that with reliable and valid tests. Now, one thing that I do think we need to consider here, and this is the bit of the elephant in the room when it comes to doing this, is validity. Now, whenever you read a paper of an experiment that's been done to understand the effects of diet on cognition or mood, authors will state this is, we picked a valid test. But of course, validity is not one single metric. There are lots of different kinds of validity. And often what they're talking about is construct validity or criterion related validity, which basically means that what you're measuring is a good approximation for the underlying concept that you want to measure, and that it relates to relevant things which would make you think it's measuring what it's supposed to do. Of course, if we're thinking about validity, how does this translate into the real world, into what the consumers are looking for? What we're actually talking about there is ecological validity. Okay? And by and large, I would say this is much less reported and much less considered in the research that we do. Historically, we have very much been interested in making sure that we use the most robust measures that are available. Unfortunately, that does take us away a little bit from those real world benefits, and it's not totally clear that all of the tests that we use necessarily would translate into things that people would be able to pick up on a day-to-day basis when they're going about their lives. We just don't have that data yet. So the best approach, which I would recommend here, is obviously we do have some tests available for some of these domains. Okay, and I focused on attention by way of one example. So, for example, we can measure focused attention using something called the Flankers task. Okay, we can measure sustained attention using a continuous performance task that tends to go on for like 5 to 10 minutes. Okay, and these are quite robust lab-based tests. And I would suggest that if you're looking at a novel nutritional substance or dietary pattern or supplement, then this is a good place to start. So yes, you can establish that there is or there isn't a beneficial effect on these lab-based tests. But as I say, whether or not this will then translate into the real world is still very much an open question. However, technology has increased in recent years, and we are able to start to bring in some more realistic, ecologically valid tasks to our research. And I would say that probably the best example here would be hydration research. So there was a study that came out a few years ago that actually looked at the effects of hydration on driving performance in a driving simulator. Now, obviously, this is much more ecologically valid than doing, for example, a Flankers task to measure focus attention, but it's still measuring attention. Okay. Also, there are many tests now being developed using virtual reality. So this is one example here called the Nespora Aquarium. So basically a person's in this VR environment and they're wandering around and they're having a look at things, and they have to respond every so often to a stimulus, so like a tone or something. And it goes on for about 18 minutes, I believe. So again, it's a more ecologically valid way of actually understanding whether or not there are effects of diet or supplements. Now, obviously, this is still not really a person in their own natural environment. It's still slightly decontextualized because oftentimes participants will come into the laboratory to do this. So there are methods, again, that are available which have studied what people do on a day-to-day basis. So again, thinking about hydration research here, we did a study a few years ago in children, understanding what the effects of drinking water were. And to do this, we just simply monitored children's behaviour in the classroom and sampled what were they getting up to sort of every 5 minutes. And as you can see in the picture down the bottom, sometimes the kids were much more interested in the ceiling than what was going on, what the teacher was talking about. And obviously by coding this, you can begin to demonstrate that actually during real world activities that there are potentially effects of diet and nutrition. So my recommendation would be that we probably need all these different kinds of research in an area in order to substantiate that there is an actual benefit that is robust and reliable and valid, but also translates into the real world. So I would imagine that you would start, for example, with a lab-based study using very valid tests and then slowly demonstrate that this actually does translate into things that are relevant to people. Okay, so there were some areas that were quite interesting because they were areas that as nutritional scientists we don't tend to look at or we don't tend to measure. So first of all, again, as we've seen in the consumer quotes that were presented, consumers did talk about remembering things from the past, so remembering where they left their keys, for example. And this is what psychologists would tend to refer to as episodic memory. Okay? But they also talked about remembering to do stuff in the future. So, for example, remembering to turn up to a Zoom meeting, remembering a doctor's appointment, and all the things that they've got to do in a day. And this is actually what psychologists refer to as prospective memory. And generally, in psychology, we don't tend to look at prospective memory in regards to nutrition at all. It is probably because it's a bit more complicated to measure than episodic memory, but it's a good example of how we could potentially expand the number of domains that we do look at to start to begin to understand whether or not there are any effects on prospective memory, because to the best of my knowledge, we have no information on that at the moment. There are different brain networks that underlie episodic and prospective memory, so I do think that it is important to understand these things separately and not just clump them together and assume there's an effect on memory, all kinds of memory, because it's a bit more complicated than that. Another area that was quite interesting is flow. So when consumers were talking about attention, they we're sometimes talking about controlled attention. So that's the kind of attention that we would normally measure in a task. So a person has to try to maintain attention. But oftentimes they were more interested in being in the zone or being in a flow state. So this essentially refers to a state of effortless attention. When a person is in the flow or they're in the zone, it's a very, very concentrated state. But there isn't a lot of effort involved in that. It feels effortless. So that's really quite interesting because it doesn't tend to be the type of attention that we would usually measure in nutritional science. So the question is there likely to be an effect on something like that? Well, we don't have any data, so we don't know. However, flow is actually quite a well-defined concept in psychology more generally. And to achieve a flow state, usually there needs to be an optimal match between the level of challenge associated with a task and a person's skill. And there are some data that demonstrate that nutrition can actually alter perceived difficulty associated with a task. So there's some indication that this could be a profitable area of research. We will need to develop tools to enable us to look at this. We'll need to validate those tools in regards to nutrition. But I do think it's an interesting potential future avenue in this area. So finally, I would add clarity and clear-headedness as a concept that the consumers actually thought was associated with lots of other concepts. So it tended to be talked about in sentences, in paragraphs with other concepts, which is why you see it as an overarching bubble here. So we do tend to measure clarity or clear-headedness, at least in a subjective sense, using questionnaires. So there are some data on this, and there is some evidence that certain aspects of nutrition can be beneficial. Unfortunately, to date, really, it hasn't been a primary outcome measure in most nutritional science. It's tended to be measured as part of a wider spectrum of mood, for example. But given that to our consumers, this did seem to be a concept that was central to sort of everything else. I think that more research that considers this as a primary outcome could be potentially quite interesting. Okay, so future directions. Well, we've talked a lot about involving the consumer in the design of our research, but of course, in order to bridge this gap, I think it needs to work both ways. So our consumers were quite knowledgeable about what they were hoping to achieve by changing their diet or taking supplements. But I imagine that's not going to be the case across the board in the general population. So I think that there is quite a lot of work that can be done in terms of increasing consumer literacy in this area. And this is one thing that IFANS has been working on more recently. So I won't go into it in too much detail, but we have been looking at how particular stakeholders will communicate complicated topics like cognitive health to the general public, and what are the best principles for doing that. I think that we need some data to demonstrate the ecological validity of the tests that we use in the laboratory, and not just simply assume that this will translate into things the consumer can detect on a day-to-day basis. Most of the ecological validity data that we have on these tests at the moment come from clinical populations or people with brain injury, where, of course, performance on the test relates to how they function in the real world, because these are quite large effects that we're talking about. When it comes to nutrition, the effects tend to be quite a lot smaller, and we really don't have very much data at all demonstrating that, yeah, you could pick it up in a controlled environment, but do people notice on a day-to-day basis? We don't know, so that needs to be tested. And I think there's lots of room for using advances in technology like VR to develop tests and validate those tests, and demonstrate that they are sensitive to nutritional interventions. And then there are these novel consumer benefits like flow, like prospective memory, that might be interesting to look at. Okay, so if anybody wants to read any more about this, this paper has now been published and is open access and available for anybody to read. So there's a lot more detail in that. So that's available. I just want to thank IFANS for supporting this research, and Swansea University, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you both so very much. I so appreciate your insights into all of these topics, and we are going to stop here, and I will turn this over to Marie to bring things to a close.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Snetzelaar. And thanks everyone for participating today and all of your questions. And a huge thank you to you, Dr. Young and Elisa Ghirardelli, for sharing your time and insights today. So we'll provide that certificate shortly after this webinar closes, and we hope everyone visits our website to learn more about this work and all of IFAN's ongoing science. So thanks everybody. Have a great afternoon.